The sound of boots striking metal reverberated through the briefing chamber of the Ecliptica. Captain Dax Renfield stood at rigid attention, hands clasped behind his back, his expression a mask of stoic professionalism. The room carried the scent of disinfectant and ozone, the signature aroma of a well-kept military vessel. Admiral Fifth paced before him, his gray uniform immaculate, his face as hard as stone. A holographic dossier hovered between them, spinning lazily. At its center was the image of a woman, a Solarian princess if her demeanor and title were to be believed. Her violet skin glowed softly in the projection's light, her hair a cascade of dark brown waves, her amethyst eyes as cold as distant stars. "Princess Junie Saranai," the Admiral began, his voice sharp and clear, "the only heir to the Secretarian throne and a linchpin for maintaining their neutrality in this godforsaken war. If the Dominion succeeds in eliminating her, Sateria's neutral stance will collapse. They'll either side with us or against us, and I don't think I need to elaborate on the consequences of the latter." Dax's gray-blue eyes flicked to the image. "You're saying the Dominion has tried this before?"
"Twice," Fifth confirmed. "Both times during official visits to Accord worlds. Serenia keeps their own security close, but even they admit their resources are stretched thin."
"That's why you're being assigned as her personal guard." "Understood, sir," Dax replied, his voice betraying no emotion, though he felt a twinge of unease inside. Babysitting a royal wasn't his typical assignment.
"You will remain at her side 24/7, Fifth continued. "That means you sleep in the same quarters, eat in the same space, and accompany her to every meeting."
"She cannot be alone." The weight of the order sank in, but Dax gave a crisp nod. "Yes, sir." "Good. Her shuttle arrives in an hour. Be ready." The docking bay of the Ecliptica buzzed with activity, but the noise fell to a hush as the Saplarian shuttle glided into place, sleek and polished. Its surface reflected the bay's harsh lights like a liquid mirror. The ramp hissed as it lowered, a fine mist curling around its edges. From the mist stepped Princess Junie Sarai, her presence commanding the room before she spoke a word. Her long, flowing gown shimmered like starlight, catching hues of lavender and silver with each movement. Her deep purple skin seemed to absorb the light, giving her an ethereal glow, while her brown hair was elegantly braided, interwoven with platinum threads. The faint hum of her jeweled cirette vibrated in the tense silence. She moved with deliberate grace, her head held high. Her amethyst eyes swept the bay, taking in the gathered officers and crew before landing on Dax. For a moment, her gaze lingered on him, sharp and assessing. "You are the one assigned to guard me?" she asked, her voice melodic but edged with skepticism. Dax stepped forward, his boots clicking on the metal deck. "Captain Dax Renfield, Your Highness. I will ensure your safety." Her lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but a flicker of something that could have been amusement or disdain. "I hope your skills match your confidence, Captain." "My life depends on it." "They do," Dax replied evenly. "You'll find I'm very good at my job." She regarded him for a moment longer before turning to her Cenarian guards. "You may return to your posts, Bayless. I trust the Accord's protection will suffice." The guards hesitated, but a pointed look from Junie sent them retreating to their shuttle. Alone now, Junie walked past Dax without another word, her silks trailing like liquid silver. Dax fell into step behind her, his expression neutral, though he couldn't ignore the way her presence seemed to draw the air out of the room. This was going to be a long mission. It didn't take long for the first snag to arise. The Ecliptica's intelligence team intercepted a coded transmission indicating another assassination attempt was imminent. In response, Admiral Fifth tightened security, ordering Junie to be relocated to the safest area aboard the ship, Dax quarters. Junie's reaction was swift and predictable. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. She stood in the Admiral's office, arms crossed, her amethyst eyes blazing. "I will not share quarters with a soldier." "It's the safest option," Fifth replied evenly, unfazed by her glare. "Captain Renfield's room is more secure than the guest suites, and he'll be able to monitor any threats closely." "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her gaze darting to Dax, who stood silently at attention. "Surely the Accord can provide more suitable accommodations." Your Highness, Dax said, his tone steady. My quarters may not be what you're used to, but they'll keep you safe. That's what matters. Her gaze snapped to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Neither spoke. Then she turned back to Fifth, her voice colder than before. Fine. If this is what's required, I will comply. The journey to Dax's quarters was made in silence. When they arrived, Junie hesitated in the doorway, her lips pressing into a thin line as she took in the small, utilitarian space. A narrow bunk was mounted to one wall. A desk, cluttered with data pads, occupied the other, and a viewport looked out into the endless expanse of space. This is where I am to stay? She asked, her tone laden with disbelief. It's secure, Dax said simply, stepping past her to clear the clutter off the desk. You'll have the bed. I'll take the chair. Her brow arched, skepticism written across her features. And you're comfortable with this arrangement? It's not about comfort, Your Highness, Dax replied. It's about keeping you alive. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she stepped inside, her gown brushing against him as she passed. Very well. Let's hope your methods are as effective as you claim. Dax said nothing, but as he sat in the chair, he found himself glancing at her more often than he intended. The confined space felt smaller with her in it, the air heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. The first night passed in intense silence, the stars outside the viewport a quiet witness to the uneasy truce forming between protector and protected. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Dax sat slouched in the lone chair, his eyes fixed on the viewport. Stars drifted by in an endless silence, their cold light a stark contrast to the fire simmering in his thoughts. Across the room, Junie perched on the edge of the narrow bunk, her purple skin glowing faintly in the dim light. She had been quiet for hours now, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but Dax could see the stiffness in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her gown. Her silence felt unnatural. You don't have to sit like that all night, Dax said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but it carried across the small space. You're going to give yourself a cramp. Junie glanced at him, her amethyst eyes narrowing slightly. I'm quite comfortable, thank you. Dax leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. Sure you are, because nothing says comfort like sitting on the edge of a bunk like you're afraid it'll bite you. Her lips quirked upward, the barest hint of a smile. I suppose you'd know, given your extensive experience with cramped quarters. More than you'd think, he said, gesturing to the chair beneath him. This thing's been my bed more nights than I can count. Not exactly what I dreamed of growing up. Her expression softened, curiosity flickering across her features. And what did you dream of? He blinked, caught off guard by the question. I didn't think about it much. Maybe being an astronomer. My dad had this old observatory back on Terra. I used to spend hours up there staring at the stars. Junie tilted her head, her braided brown hair spilling over one shoulder. An astronomer? That seems incongruous. Yeah, well, life has a way of throwing curveballs, he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. The war started, and looking at stars didn't seem as important as fighting for what was left of home. Quote, dot. For a moment, Junie said nothing, her gaze distant. Then she spoke, her voice soft. I used to dream too, you know, of exploring the galaxy, seeing its wonders firsthand. She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Instead, I've been confined to palaces and shuttles, meeting rooms and battle plans. Dax studied her, the faint glow of her skin giving her an ethereal quality. What stopped you? Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw the weight of her crown in her gaze. Duty, she said simply. The same thing that stopped you. The days that followed blurred into a routine of forced proximity. Junie slowly began to relax in Dax's presence, though her sharp tongue still made occasional appearances. Dax found himself drawn to her more than he cared to admit. Her intelligence, her resilience, the way she carried herself even in the face of assassination attempts and isolation. One evening, as they sat by the viewport, Junie broke the silence with a question. Do you miss it? Home? Dax glanced at her. She was sitting cross-legged on the bunk, her hair loose and tumbling over her shoulders. She looked less like a princess and more like a woman burdened by the weight of her station. Sometimes, he admitted, but it's not the same place I left. The war changed it.
She nodded, her gaze distant.
I imagine it's the same for Serenia. My people look to me for strength, for answers. But sometimes I don't feel strong. I don't feel like I have the answers. Her vulnerability caught him off guard. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. You don't have to have all the answers, Junie. Sometimes just being there is enough. She smiled faintly at his use of her name. And who's there for you, Captain? The question hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Dax opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Junie's gaze met his, her amethyst eyes searching his face as though trying to read his thoughts. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, softer than he'd imagined. The small gesture was electric, a spark igniting between them.
Junie?
He drew his hand back, the reality of what he'd done crashing over him. I'm sorry, Your Highness. I don't. She said softly, cutting him off. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the whirlwind of emotions she was fighting. Don't apologize. For a long moment they sat in silence, the space between them charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Then, slowly, Junie leaned closer, her gaze never leaving his. Dax's breath hitched as her lips brushed his. Light, hesitant, as though testing the waters. The kiss deepened gradually, her hands sliding to his shoulders as he cupped her face in his calloused palms. It was a clash of fire and restraint, a moment of raw emotion that both of them knew was forbidden. When they finally broke apart, Junie's cheeks were flushed, her breathing uneven. This can't happen, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's wrong. Dax's thumb brushed her cheek, his gaze steady. Then why does it feel so right, Ty? She didn't answer, but the way her lips met his again was all the answer he needed.
Morning aboard the Ecliptica was indistinguishable from night. But when Dax opened his eyes, the weight of the previous evening was as tangible as the dull ache in his chest. He sat up in the chair, stretching his arms, his gaze instinctively flickering to the bunk. Junie was already awake. She stood by the viewport, silhouetted against the endless expanse of stars, her brown hair cascading down her back, loose and unadorned, a stark contrast to her usual intricate braids. Her gown shimmered faintly in the dim light, the soft silver fabric shifting with her every movement.
You should be resting, Dax said without turning. So should you, she replied, her voice gentle. He turned to her, his expression weary but warm. Couldn't. Too much on my mind. I know. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the unspoken words between them louder than anything they could have said. The revelation of Crest's betrayal had shaken Serenia's council. The captain's treachery not only exposed the fractures in their defenses, but also the delicate balance of Junie's authority. They want you gone, Junie said finally, her voice trembling as she met Dax's gaze. Dax's heart clenched, though he had been expecting it. Then I'll go. No! Her hand shot out, gripping his arm. I won't let them dictate this. We've given everything, risked everything. Why can't they see that? Because they don't care about us, he said softly, his hand covering hers. They care about what you represent. And they're right, Junie. Your people need you. You can't have this and them, not the way they expect.
Her tears spilled over, her voice breaking.
Then I'll abdicate. Let someone else take the crown. He shook his head, his grip tightening. You know that's not the answer, Derricks. You're the only one who can lead Serenia through this. You're stronger than any of them, Junie. They need you more than I ever could.
And what about you? She asked, her voice trembling. What happens to you?
I'll survive, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Because I know you're out there. Because I know everything we've done, everything we've been through, wasn't for nothing. The farewell was private. Just the two of them in the royal gardens beneath the Siderian stars. The faint hum of the planet's energy fields buzzed in the distance, a reminder of the world that would carry on without him. Junie clung to Dax, her arms wrapped around his neck as if letting go would shatter her.
I'll miss you, she whispered, her tears dampening his collar.
You'll do more than that, he said, his voice low and rough. You'll rule. You'll lead. You'll survive. Her lips found his in a kiss that was desperate, bittersweet, and final. When they broke apart, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "I love you," she said, her voice barely audible. "And I'll always love you," he replied, his hands cupping her face. "No matter where I am." As the sun began to rise, Dax stepped back, his hands lingering on hers before finally letting go. He turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. Junie watched him go, her heart breaking with every passing moment. But as the first light of dawn washed over the garden, she straightened, her head held high. She was Serenia's queen now, and she would carry the strength he had given her into everything that lay ahead. Years later, in the quiet moments of the night, Junie would stand on her balcony, her gaze fixed on the stars. She would remember Dax's smile, the sound of his voice, the feel of his hands in hers. She would wonder if he was out there somewhere, looking at the same stars and thinking of her. For Dax, the galaxy became his sanctuary here. He returned to the front lines, his reputation growing as a soldier and protector. But in the stillness between battles, he would close his eyes and see her, his queen, his love, his reason to keep fighting. They lived separate lives, bound by duty and distance, but their hearts remained connected across the vast expanse of the galaxy, and in the endless silence of the stars, their love endured.